topic that I'm going to discuss today is customizing Magnolia workflow. And back when we were formulating the conference, I was asked if there was anything that maybe I could present this year. And recently I had done some work with Stephen customizing a workflow for VSP. And I thought it would be a great topic for this conference because I think a lot of customers encounter a situation where they need a custom workflow, and you guys could benefit from what we learned, the two of us going through this process of using the new workflow engine. So first, for those of you who don't know me, one of the great things about my job is that I get to go to the client site and I get to meet people face to face. So I've met a lot of you. I see a lot of familiar faces out there. But I'm the support engineer for Magnolia Americas. Before I worked for Magnolia, I was a client of Magnolia at Manatee County. And so all in all, between the two jobs, I have about 7 years of experience working with Magnolia on various different versions. So before I get started about the topic, customizing workflow, let's just back up a little bit and get a little history lesson about how workflow has changed over time. So back in Magnolia 4.5, we used OpenWFE as our workflow engine. It was an XML file-based system, and it had no visual modeler. So it made it a little difficult to work with, but it wasn't overly complicated. But now the project has been discontinued. It's changed hands a couple of times, but it's discontinued. So we were left with the question, now what do we do? How are we going to do workflow going forward? So the alternative chosen was JBPM. And in Magnolia 5.0, we introduced a workflow module based on JBPM 5. In Espen's own words, if you haven't seen it, he has a webinar out there, the complete guide to Magnolia CMS workflows. And he mentions in that webinar that this earlier module was a rudimentary integration. I think, the conversations that I've had with him, he's expressed to me that it's been a little bit of a learning curve for him as well, learning JBPM. So some of the earlier modules aren't as great as what we have now. And during this time period, there was only incremental fixes. So when Magnolia 5.2.4 was released, that was a milestone for workflow. There was quite a few changes made. For example, we had a module based on now JBPM 6, and since we were making that change as well, Espen also took the opportunity to rewrite the persistence and to simplify configuration as much as we could. So what this ended up happening now is when Magnolia 5.2.4 was released, we have a new minor version of workflow modules. So there's a discrepancy now introduced here. So Magnolia 5.2.4 is actually bundled with workflow module 5.3.1. So just keep that in mind when you're working with the workflow module. So the workflow module itself is actually made up of two modules. First, we have the actual workflow module. It's an engine-agnostic integration module. And it enables the necessary integration points for Magnolia to communicate with any workflow engine. Then we have workflow JBPM module, which is our JBPM integration module. And what this module does is it takes care of the loading of business processes and work item handlers. So workflow out of the box. So what do you get from this module day one? You still have the 4i content approval workflow that we've always had, but it's only implemented on the Pages app by default. But it's real simple to configure it on any content app if you need to. And there's a documentation page on doing just that. So that brings us up to date with the workflow module. Now we get to talk about here what this topic is actually about, and that's a custom workflow. So what if you need more actors or custom work items or possibly parallel activities, things like that? So we enter in JBPM. So what is JBPM? It's the bridge between business analysts and developers. And what I think a lot of people find is that traditional BPM engines have a focus that is limited to just non-technical people. But the goal of JBPM was to have dual focus. We want to deliver process management features in a way that both developers and business analysts like it. So what does JBPM do? Well, what it does is it allows you to model your business goals. And the way it does that is you describe the steps that need to be executed to achieve that goal and the order. And we do this using a flowchart. It also allows you to execute business processes using the BPM 2.0 specification, which is now the de facto standard for BPMN. And when you're modeling a workflow, you have three core elements that you're going to work with. You have events, you have activities, and you have gateways. So the next thing that we're going to talk about here is the graphical modeling tool. It allows creation and editing of BPM diagrams. And it's an Eclipse plugin. So if you're familiar with working with Eclipse, you can simply download the plugin and you're ready to go. But next slide. So it looks something like this in Eclipse. So this is a BPMN file 2.0. And these are the events and the gateways that I was speaking about. But if you don't like using Eclipse, you're an IntelliJ developer, there's also a web-based version of this modeler too. So when we're modeling, a couple of key elements that we need to speak about are tasks, work items, and work item handlers. So what tasks do? Tasks fill the gap with human interaction. So tasks allow us to get input from some human user into our workflow. And you can register any custom task that you want in your module. You just create a subconfiguration called task in your module, and there you can register them. Tasks were introduced in the newer version of the workflow module. Before what we were doing, we were using a messaging-based system. And this messaging-based system was very much like email. So whenever someone initiated a workflow, every publisher would get a message about that. So let's say one publisher comes in and acts on that particular item, maybe clears out its message. A lot of other people were left wondering what happened. They would have a message in their inbox, but nothing to act on. So we introduced tasks to have a clear status and assignee. So what happens now is a user comes in, they assign that task to themselves, everybody else can see that they have done that, they can see who it's been assigned to, and then they can act on it, and then it goes away. So no, no one's left wondering what happened with that particular item. So next are work items. A work item is a unit of work that needs to be executed. And when we're talking about custom work items, that's also known as domain-specific. And what this does is the work item has all the necessary information that it needs to execute this unit of work, provided to it by parameters. So we push in parameters into the work item, and then it acts on that data. And it possibly could provide a result as well, if need be. And work items are actually executed by what's called a work item handler. And the work item handler is a Java class used to execute work items, and should never contain any data. So really, it's just the code that it needs to do to execute that work item. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it off to Steven, and he's going to tell you a little bit about VSP and the custom workflow that we did for the Eyefinity project.
So hello, my name is Steven McDermott. I am the Magnolia Enterprise Support in our GTS department at VSP Global. GTS stands for Global Technology Solutions. It's our fancy way of saying IT department. But there's a lot that goes into that, and there's more to that, but I'm not going to talk about that today too much. Where I come from specifically, I'm working with Magnolia Enterprise because that's in my title, because VSP also uses the community edition of Magnolia for some of our older projects that eventually will be migrated to the newer enterprise solution. We wanted to take advantage of some of the enterprise features, such as multi-site and the workflow and everything else. I've been working with Magnolia for about a year now, so it's been a good learning process. I had never really worked with or seen Magnolia before that, before I worked at VSP. And it's been a pretty awesome experience learning this technology. Next slide, please. So who's VSP? If you've never heard of VSP, or if you know anybody with glasses, they probably know what VSP is. VSP, we have a mission statement. We help people see. There's a lot of charity work that goes into VSP. They have mobile optometrists that go out to lower income neighborhoods and give them glasses for free, things like that. Basically, our entire goal as a company is to make sure anybody that needs glasses can get them. We're the largest not-for-profit vision benefit and service company. That contains about 75 million VSP vision care members worldwide, 32,000 network providers. And our focus is connecting those members to those providers so they can get excellent eye care and eyewear services. So Magnolia came into this because one of our business units, Eyefinity, was trying to migrate off of an older CMS that wasn't doing the job for them. And the decision to move to Magnolia was made because we already had some familiar knowledge with some of our employees with Magnolia, and it just seemed like the right solution. Next slide. I should also mention that we're currently working on another project with another one of our business units, Marshawn, Energy Edge, who's sponsoring this event, is involved in that and doing a lot of the development currently. So our motivation for the custom workflow. Eyefinity had requested a 6-eye implementation. Obviously, as Rich said, we have a 4-eye implementation out of the box, so we had to expand upon this. The 6-eye implementation needed to have some specific set of features in it. What this needed to do was email specific users in the right groups of users, as well as a customized pulse inside Magnolia and the pulse messaging system. We wanted to make sure they had all the information they needed in the right format. This has become, as I've seen it day to day, the changes we made to it, this is actually more important than they would think. A lot of our users actually copy things out of the pulse item. Just the way they do their day-to-day business is important. So while these tasks are pretty simple, while the features are pretty simple, they played a key role day to day to them, to our content editors and reviewers. We have a fairly large team of content editors for the Eyefinity project. I'd say for just content editors straightforward, they've probably have 20 or 30 in the VSP location, but we have multiple locations where they're all communicating and making sure they get what they need done. And also along with that, because we have so many, there's a steady stream. I see almost daily content changes on that site, and new content creation. They're using that to really drive business with what Eyefinity provides, which is software for doctors to use in their offices, one of their main goals. So the motivation for why this whole project came about is because we planned an upgrade of Magnolia. The main reason is we want to stay within 3 releases of Magnolia so that we're taking advantage of the new features, any bug fixes, any new implementations of anything we can take advantage of. So we were moving from Magnolia 5.2.2, which was delivered to us by Energy Edge, who developed the Eyefinity site originally, as well as our original workflow. We were jumping up to 5.3.2 at the time. And just calling out again that the workflow versioning changed. We were going from workflow 5.2.2 to workflow 5.4.1. And what that did was essentially break what was there because we weren't using what the new workflow needed. Next slide, please. So when we were doing the basically when I was working on the workflow, we discovered all these changes that happened. The introduction of human tasks and the task assignment within human task as an object within the JBPM workflow. And our workflow had no concept of the human tasks. And that tasking system, I just want to call that out, was a big pain point day to day for our users. The email style tasking, or the email style of the workflow before. No one had any idea what they were doing. There'd be 99 messages in their Pulse item, and or Pulse messaging system. They had no idea who had worked on what. It was all through email and talking, and luckily they sit near each other, but like I mentioned, we have remote locations, and the same people working on the same items, and some of the future updates to the workflow, I think, are really going to continue to assist at that. So we began converting the workflow, and I realized I really didn't know what I was doing with the workflow. It was brand new. Because Energy Edge had done such a good job, I never had to touch the code once until this moment. I realized I needed to reach out. I reached out to support, and Rich and Zdenek, I believe, helped as well. We went back and forth, probably 60, 70 messages back and forth, figuring out all the little items that I needed. Rich even took the time to get on the phone with me a few times and do a WebEx and make sure that I got what I needed and I understood what I was doing and why I was doing it. And I just calling out, the support is really easy. If you're familiar at all with Jira, Magnolia uses their Jira support system, and just putting that in and getting a response within 4 hours is a fantastic experience. Next slide, please. So this is the approach. The goals were to use as much existing code and functionality without any drastic changes. This was basically, we wanted to save time and money. We didn't want to sit there redeveloping the entire workflow. We wanted to use what was already given to us as solid code. We wanted to keep all the prior functionality, which are the list of items. The functionality that we wanted to have was already there, but we wanted to keep it and improve upon it. We wanted to take advantage of the tasks, task assignment, and improve Pulse messaging. Next, please. Here's what our old workflow looked like. This is built on workflow module 522, and you'll note there's no human tasks, and we only have configured custom tasks in here. And by custom tasks are the activities here. Rich called out the 3 items. There's the events, gateways, and activities. These 2 guys at the end, the green and the red ones, those are the events. That's what kicks off our workflow. So when a content editor makes a change, they would kick it off. This custom activity named review at the beginning would start off the process. This is where code would actually execute. That's tied directly to a work item handler, which are configured inside Magnolia. This is where the emails would get sent, the Pulse messaging would get decided, and also in the old workflow, this is where the result of approval or rejection for any content changes would make it through this gateway right here, which is the yellow, one of these guys put down there. This is where you'll see the arrows accepting or rejecting. It would move on through the workflow, and it would go and so on, all the way up to the actual activation stage. I'm going to call out something later with this. The activation would actually handle the activating it from the author instance to the public instances, and of course, error handling as necessary. Next slide, please. So this is what we got with the workflow module 5.4. And again, calling out the versioning number. This isn't Magnolia 5.4, workflow 5.4. It's a 4IA implementation. You'll see we have the little guy here on the review and publish. That's a human task. That's what you're going to see inside the JBPM when you're actually modeling your workflow. And you'll notice this guy right here with the thicker lines is what's known as a call activity. Calling activity is a fancy way of saying you can call it another workflow that looks like this. It helps in developing if you have separate workflows that don't really tie directly to each other, and you want to call off something else, you want to separate your code, you want to modularize what you have, it really helps. So this is what Rich pointed me to as an example. This is where I learned what I needed to learn about the workflow and a well-done workflow. From this, I was going to reuse what this call activity is actually doing for the publication. Next, please. So this is what's actually called. This is also out of the box with Magnolia. The call activity, each one of these workflows has an ID, and you'll call to this activity. And Magnolia also introduced scheduling with their workflow. You could actually schedule items to show up at any time on the public site. So you could put together a large marketing change, schedule all your publishing, and it would actually make it out, say you wanted midnight tonight. It would all happen at the same time through the same transactional activation that Magnolia uses otherwise. This is just handling, the basic behind this workflow is that it's handling that actual activation and the error handling as necessary, and just calling out, this is going off to another workflow. It's a call activity with the thicker borders. Next, please. So this is what you're actually going to look at in Eclipse. You may notice that mine looks a little different from Rich's because I'm working on Kepler in Eclipse and he's on Luna. So if you're noticing some differences, that's why. First thing you're going to notice here is on the left, the palette view. This is where you're going to find your events, gateways, and activities. I have highlighted here the call activity because I want to show how that's configured. When you put that call activity, you drag it onto your screen, onto your workflow. You have to configure it. It comes up in this properties window. This is the actual ID of the Magnolia workflow that I'm calling there. And there's in and out parameters that Rich mentioned as well that you want to provide. This is the data transferring from step to step. You don't have to create data or destroy data. It just passes through the workflow seamlessly. You don't have to tell it to pass through. It is there. You just have to tell your work item handler or your call activity what it needs to take in from the workflow. Next slide, please. Let's see. All right, so with the new workflow, we took advantage of the custom tasks that we created. Those are the, you'll see again on another slide, they're the custom tasks are signified by the red square in the corner. The human tasks raised a question. What do we do? What code goes behind this? Some sort of code has to execute. Well, Magnolia comes with a human task work item handler right out of the box that we didn't have to touch or change. We just had to tell it we were using that code. We were able to keep every single one of our existing work item handlers and make one slight change to all of them to make sure the code actually executed. It was a very easy migration to actually implement. Learning it was a whole different story. So it's a good time to, I think, here to call out to make sure you understand if you're working in the workflow, the difference between tasks, work items, what a work item handler is, and the purpose behind each one of these tools that you're using, rather than just kind of going willy-nilly and coding something. The specific changes that we made was there was the package of classes that I believe it was a Drools package that they're the same object items, work item, managers, work items, and there's one other I'm forgetting at the moment. What we did, they changed to a KIE package, and we had to change that. Really, there was no change to the code at that point because they're the same object type, they're the same implementation type. What we did have to do is we have to call this right here. It's part of the work item manager class, completing the work item. Each one of those steps in the older workflow that you saw only completed when someone approved or rejected it. That's what signified and kicked off the next set of code. With this is the only way you're going to get those to complete and move on to the next human task. And in our case, what we did was we inserted the human tasks after every one of our custom work item handlers. They can go before or after, it doesn't really matter. It's just where you need them in your workflow. Everyone has different needs. What this helped us do was to modularize our workflow. So at any point, if we want to change pieces of it, if the publishing step needs to change for some reason, business has a new requirement, we can go in and change just one part of it. It's not tied to one big set of code or big configuration. You can insert new items, take things out. It works just fine as it is. Next slide, please. So what did we learn? Do you want to go? You first on this? Okay. So changes to any BPMN diagram requires a restart. So if you're working in Eclipse and you're working locally and you're changing it, adding a new call activity, adding that, Magnolia, although uses observation heavily, in this case, it doesn't work the same way as a lot of other configuration in Magnolia. You'll actually see a message in your logging in your console that says, here's what work item handlers and tasks you have loaded. it signifies that you've made a change and says you will need to restart to see any changes. So if you're sitting there frustrated that your code isn't executing, that's why.
Then another thing that I noticed, if you want to start using Java 8, or if you're already using Java 8, JBPM version 6.2 is the only one compatible with Java 8. So if you have a current project right now, it's just as simple as just updating your POM to bring in the new version, and it will work just fine. I have some customers that I know of already have done that, and Magnolia 5.3.9 will have that change already implemented in there for you.
All right. I've already mentioned this once, but there is a slight difference between some of the plugins. So one very basic thing, make sure you get the right version for the right version of Eclipse that you're on. I personally made the mistake of just grabbing the first one I found and wreaked havoc on my workspace. So make sure you get the right one. A lot of plugins are agnostic to whatever version of Eclipse. Some of them aren't. This one isn't. Yeah, and they're just going to look a little bit different, but overall they should look the same.
Yeah, some of the labels are different between. I've experimented with Indigo, Kepler, and Luna, and I just noticed little differences here and there between labels and stuff like that. Another thing that I've learned is the upgrade procedure. So you want to make sure before you upgrade your version of Magnolia that all of the workflows have completed successfully. If they haven't, upgrading can, I don't know exactly what's happening underneath there, but can screw up any workflows you try to initiate after the upgrade. So just make sure that all of these workflows have completed successfully.
Okay, this one's a little more technical and specific, but in the work item handlers, as you saw, the custom ones with the red dots on them, you have to provide in and out parameters. One of the things you don't have to do is provide an output parameter of the MGNL data object, which is a map of work item properties. It'll pull in anything from who's publishing it, what date it's published, and you can add and take data. This is the data that's transferred throughout the workflow. If you provide the MGNL data as an output, it'll empty that map of data. This was frustrating to learn and figure out, but it's just how it worked. It's kind of a gem because you don't have to do any work to pass it on. It's actually less work, and I was overdoing what I needed. But this is one that kind of jumped out at me for everyone. Might be useful to know.
Yeah, and then don't forget about the discrepancy in version numbers. You might start going crazy thinking there's something wrong with your POM because you're bringing in a version of workflow that's greater than the version of Magnolia that you're on. But just keep in mind that there is a discrepancy that was introduced in 5.2.4. So the workflow module will always be a step ahead as far as versioning numbers are concerned. So if you need more help with workflow, you have a project in mind, you have something coming up, what can you do? I did mention Espen's webinar. That was in August of 2014, but all of that is still relevant today. And it's a great place to start if you're going to start doing a custom workflow, is just listen to that webinar. I've written a couple of tutorials as well. One, how to do a 6i workflow, and also I rewrote Espen's earlier tutorial that was based on the earlier version of the workflow module. It's how to do a custom work item, for example, send an email. Also documentation, of course, we always have documentation out there on workflow, and then support. So contact me if you need some help. I mean, I've been doing all this work. I've been trying to become as well-versed as I can in workflow. So let me share that knowledge with you. Just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. Again, that's Espen's webinar is out there on YouTube. My tutorials, 6i workflow using Eclipse Luna. I specify here Eclipse Luna, and in these tutorials, I try to point out where I notice discrepancies between maybe Indigo and Kepler. Those are the only other ones that I've worked with. And then enabling workflow on content apps. So, you've written a content app and you want to have workflow attached to that, here's that tutorial as well. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for listening to our presentation.
Thank you.